on Zoom. So if you have questions that come up while our presenter is talking about agroforestry tonight, then you can go ahead and use the chat to drop your question, and we will keep track of those and answer those questions at the end of the presentation. So we will get started from there. So we want to begin by introducing the Thurston Conservation District team that is on the call this evening. So my name is Kiana Sinner. I'm the Senior Education and Outreach Specialist here at the Conservation District. And Jay, I'll invite you to unmute yourself and introduce yourself as well.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Jay Townsend. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm the Education and Outreach Assistant at Thurston Conservation District. So I handle a lot of volunteer coordination, event planning, social media, and really supporting the education and outreach team in any way that I can. I've been here a little over a year, and I'm so excited to be a part of this project.
Great, thanks, Jay. And Jay will also be offering any tech support throughout the webinar this evening. So if you're having any trouble hearing or seeing what's going on, you can either email Jay or you can send them a chat. And they're going to put their contact information in the chat right now, so you will all have it. So this workshop is being hosted by the Thurston Conservation District. So here at Thurston Conservation District, we've been working with local residents since 1948. We just celebrated our 75th year. We serve residents of Thurston County who reside upon the indigenous lands of the Nisqually, Chehalis, and Squaxin peoples. We're one of 45 districts here in the state of Washington, and there are over 3,000 soil and water conservation districts nationally. So if you're joining us from outside of Thurston County or outside of Washington State, we would encourage you to connect with your local conservation district. Conservation districts were first formed in the 1930s as a local, place, and community-based response to natural resource concerns. Nationally, conservation districts provide incentive-based programs, education, and non-regulatory technical assistance that makes it accessible and more affordable for private landowners and residents to implement conservation on their property or in their home. So all of the work that we do is non-regulatory and voluntary. And because conservation districts are locally oriented, we're able to build all of our programming and offerings around the needs of our specific local community, which is really cool. And this workshop is actually a part of that response to local needs. So last year, we were awarded a Sustainable Farms and Fields grant from the Washington State Conservation Commission, which we're very grateful for. So this grant is focused on making it easier and more affordable for farmers and ranchers to bring climate-smart practices and projects to their landscape. So in our local area, an area of strong interest was agroforestry. And so Thurston Conservation District has teamed up with several local organizations like Washington State University Forestry Extension, Native Plant Salvage, and several others to develop informational webinars and hands-on opportunities for our community to learn together about this topic. So tonight is one of those exciting learning opportunities. We also have 2 hands-on learning opportunities happening over the next 2 weekends. And later this evening, we'll talk a bit more about how you can get involved in those activities, so stay tuned. But I want to kick us off tonight by introducing our presenter, Patrick Schultz. So Patrick is the Washington State University Extension Forester for the southwest corner of Washington State. Patrick is known as one of our local agroforestry experts and has been working diligently to create educational opportunities and resources for small forest landowners and agricultural producers in this region. Prior to taking his job with WSU, Patrick lived in Michigan, where he was born and raised, and had spent the last several years working for nonprofit organizations that utilize volunteers, education, and outreach to create healthier forests in both urban and natural settings. Patrick went to Michigan State University to earn a Bachelor's of Science in Forestry, and then went on to earn a Master's of Science in Forestry, also from Michigan State University. And that's where he conducted research that focused on agroforestry and restoring soil with sustainable nutrient cycling. He hopes to continue to use this range of experience and passion for teaching and continue to develop programming that enables our local community members to achieve diverse management objectives. So we are very excited to have Patrick joining us this evening, and I am going to hand it off to him, and he's going to pop up his presentation and take it away. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kiana. All right, let's go through the awkward part here. Can you see the correct screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much for that intro, Kiana. And it's been a pleasure to work with you and Jay on this project. You know, I'm an avid agroforester enthusiast. I love agroforestry, and it's been really exciting to see some of the momentum going on in the region around this. I truly think we're at this sort of tipping point where we're going to start to see a lot more agroforestry taking place soon. And there's a number of reasons for that. So what I'm going to talk about today, and if I'm at any point not coming through clearly, just let me know and I'll get my mic a little closer. Is going to be kind of just an introduction to agroforestry. It's such a broad topic, and the things I'll touch on today, I mean, realistically, there are 12 to 20 other webinars worth of information that we could go into the nitty gritty on each of these. And I hope that some of the folks on the line will be joining us this Saturday and next Saturday as well to go and get our hands dirty and actually, plant some trees and really do some agroforestry on the ground. And there'll be other opportunities to learn there too, especially getting into like the planning and design of agroforestry. But largely what I'll be talking about today is conceptual, as well as talking a little bit about some of the other activities and efforts from WSU and other universities and nonprofits, et cetera, around agroforestry. All right, so we got to start with a definition, right? We all need to have a shared understanding of what agroforestry is. And there's a number of different definitions. I like this one, an integrated approach to farming with trees and livestock that produces many benefits for the people and the land. It's nice and vague, leaves lots of room for flexibility. And I really enjoy this graphic to look at a farmscape that has trees incorporated in many different ways. And it's obviously listing all the multiple benefits that we get from agroforestry. And we'll be talking a lot about this. This is the definition according to the feds, the powers that be, the National Agroforestry Center. This is an equally great definition. It's the intentional combination of agriculture and forestry to create productive and sustainable land use practices. And to take it a little bit further, I put these 4 I's in here. When I studied agroforestry in grad school, we learned about the 4 I's of agroforestry. If it doesn't meet the 4 I's, then it's not agroforestry. And this is just to say that it's more than just trees on farms. Agroforestry is intentional, it's integrated, it's intensively managed, and it's interactive. So it's not just having a cluster of trees out on your farm that you haven't gotten around to doing anything with yet. No, you're designing systems with trees and perennial crops in mind, both in the short term and the long term. So it's really important to distinguish that, or to make that distinguishment and keep that in mind as we sort of define some of these agroforestry practices, because it really is the difference between agroforestry and something totally different that maybe doesn't have all the same benefits. So looking at it another way, as Kiana mentioned, my background is forestry. I like to think of agroforestry as sort of returning the benefits of the forest to agricultural landscapes. A lot of our agricultural lands used to be forest, and then obviously there was, land conversion in order to grow food, which is clearly very important, and we all know that. But what agroforestry can offer is sort of a compromise to some degree, and to bring some of those ecosystem services that were lost through that land conversion back into play. And I've listed some of them here. We all know how great forests are and the services that they provide. And this is not an exhaustive list, but things like water quality, air quality, carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, soil health, et cetera, et cetera. These are all things that can be achieved when we design agroforestry systems. And these are some of the basic principles of agroforestry. This is not an exhaustive list either. Utilizing and enhancing beneficial biological interactions, minimizing losses or inefficiencies. Sometimes I think this is why I actually like agroforestry, because I have a brain that really focuses on efficiency. And at the end of the day, what agroforestry does, one of the best things agroforestry does is it's incredibly efficient at using light, water, and nutrients. Very minimal losses from that system, and that's part of the sustainability of it. And in the process, it creates this what we call a functional agro ecosystem. So diversifying, maximizing outputs, building farm resilience in the process, managing for biodiversity and ecosystem services, restoring degraded soils, and of course, carbon sequestration. This is a big one. A lot of people talking about carbon sequestration for obvious reasons, trying to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. Trees obviously are a very powerful tool in that fight. And so as a result, agroforestry has been consistently named as a climate smart practice and a practice with really high potential for mitigating climate change. But I don't like to focus entirely on carbon sequestration because as you look here at the list, it's just one of many of the benefits of agroforestry. But again, this is something that is catching a lot of attention. The reason that we're seeing more funding available to do these agroforestry practices is largely around the climate change conversation. This graph is a good example of when you look at all these different management practices, why agroforestry has so much potential as a climate smart practice and a climate mitigation practice. So it is really exciting time. It's an exciting time to be in positions like mine and like Kiana and Jay, because, for the first time, we're seeing grants come down that are actually not just naming agroforestry, but saying agroforestry is a high priority practice. Whereas before you had to kind of flex what you were doing and kind of convince funders to pay for this kind of work. So it's really exciting. Now, of course, it would be silly to not point out that these are not new concepts. Agroforestry at its core stems from indigenous practices and indigenous knowledge, what we would call traditional ecological knowledge. We know, despite the uh, uh, narrative that forests were more or less pristine prior to European settlement, we know that they were actually intensively managed for centuries, thousands of years even, and managed for, in many cases, non-timber forest products, which is a form of agroforestry for sure. And we can draw from traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, to support modern adoption of agroforestry. And we cannot assume, it's wrong to assume that for us and not in the indigenous community that information is going to be just broadly available to us, but it is certainly a great opportunity for partnership to work and build off that knowledge that exists, and then address new knowledge gaps around agroforestry and what that looks like. So this is a project that I'm working on with a number of really great folks, developing an indigenous agroforestry community of practice in the Pacific Northwest. It's a really great project led by EcoTrust. And more to come with this. And if someone bugs me at the end of this, I will put a link in the chat where you can see a story map that kind of describes some of the work being done here. So I really think agroforestry is for everyone. My traditional work is to support forest owners. And then sort of more and more, I'm getting into supporting farms and agriculture work through all this agroforestry stuff, which I'm really excited about. But I really think, agroforestry provides opportunities for a lot of different folks. For forest owners, it can be sort of hobby, producing something for personal use in their forest, managing for non-timber forest products, and forest farming is a great way to do that. There's also opportunities for supplemental income. We'll talk about shiitake, growing shiitake on logs towards the end of the talk. For homesteaders and hobby farms, some of that same stuff applies, but because there's a little more of an agricultural bend there, there's opportunities for silvopasture if you have livestock, windbreaks and hedgerows, ways to increase productivity and diversify your productivity for personal use. And then at the larger scale, for some of the commercial agricultural producers, there's diversified production at scale. Diversified agricultural systems are more resilient to, economic changes, environmental challenges, things like that. And also, agroforestry can mitigate some of the negative environmental impacts that are sort of inherent to large scale agriculture. It just kind of happens. Things like degraded water quality, maybe degraded soil health in some cases, forest loss, habitat loss. And the other practices here, alley cropping, silvopasture, working riparian buffers, those can all apply at larger scales for agricultural producers. So I want to start by talking about one of the key elements of agroforestry being species interactions. It's kind of the thing that makes agroforestry is we're actually, instead of taking one species that we really like corn or soybeans, and just getting really, really good at growing that, instead we're growing multiple crops and we're looking at how those species can interact to benefit the larger system. So I really like this description here of a productivity of an agroforestry system as being the net result of the positive and negative interactions among the components. It's not important that you memorize these terms here on the right, but they're just describing, in a given interaction between species one and species two, all the different types of interactions where one benefits, one is harmed, where one benefits and the one is totally unaffected. Obviously, we're probably all familiar with competition, where when two species are grown together, neither of them are having a good time. So there's a lot of different possibilities there. So there's a good example in enhanced nutrient cycling as an example of species interactions in agroforestry. And I really like this graphic. Unfortunately, I don't know where it came from, so I can't credit it properly. But I am still using it, so we'll keep that a secret. But it demonstrates what we describe in agroforestry as enhanced nutrient cycling, which happens when you incorporate perennial crops with deeper rooting systems and with annual crops, which tend to have less deep root systems. So on the left here, we have a forest ecosystem, which is incredibly efficient at using resources like light, water, and nutrients. And as a result, you have very little runoff. If you're looking at just nutrients in particular, very little nutrient losses, very little leaching from the system. There's just a lot of efficient. If there's enough nutrients somewhere, something's going to grow in order to suck that up and make use of it. So that's like a forest ecosystem. They're incredibly efficient at that. And then they actually cycle it through leaf drop, development of organic matter in the soil, and again, increasing that efficiency. Now let's skip over to C over here, where you have sort of a more traditional agricultural system like corn. I'm from Michigan. I grew up in corn and soybeans, very familiar with it. Of course, at any time in the year, you can go and rip a corn stalk out of the ground with no problem. That's because their root systems are very shallow. And that does lead to some problems in terms of efficient use of resources, right? They're not going to be able to capture resources deeper in the soil. And as, soil amendments, soil additions like fertilizer are added, they leach into the deeper layers of the soil and become lost, often going into the aquifer, being washed into, streams, et cetera, which presents other problems. So just not an incredibly efficient use of resources. In fact, some of the numbers around how these systems capture fertilizer, it's really quite abysmal, like the percent of fertilizer that they're actually able to capture. Now, if we look at an agroforestry system, which in a sense incorporates concepts from both, you have deep-rooted trees and then an annual crop being grown between. This is what we would call an alley crop. You can kind of I'm sure you understand where I'm going with this. The trees are able to capture nutrients at deeper layers in the soil. They cycle them through their leaves, adding organic matter to the soil, which then makes it available to the annual crop in the middle for the long term. And of course, there's more corn in this picture than there is in here, so you're losing out on growing space. But with an agroforestry system, we're always thinking about, okay, well, let's plant a tree that can produce another crop. A walnut, a chestnut, a hazelnut, or some sort of berry or something like that. So you're diversifying and then hopefully becoming greater than the sum of your parts. Another example of a beneficial interaction is nitrogen fixation and transfer. This is what I studied in grad school. I was actually able to use isotopic tracing to study how nitrogen coming from an herbaceous legume like clover or vetch was actually being transferred to nearby trees just by exuding out of these root nodules, which is where the bacteria live that fix that nitrogen. So I'm not going to dig into the nitrogen process too much here. This is a really cool graphic that explains it quite well. But basically, some of you know, I'm sure that nitrogen fixers, there are certain species that can actually capture atmospheric nitrogen, take N2 gas, and through a beneficial relationship with bacteria and their roots, turn it into plant available forms of nitrogen, which would be like your nitrates and your ammoniums. And then they use that to grow. But in the process, that nitrogen can also be um, transferred to other species. For instance, when this plant dies and that organic matter goes into the soil, it puts all that nitrogen in there. And then sometimes, as I said, it actually just exudes and is picked up by the associated plant. So it's actually really interesting. And it's another example of a beneficial relationship, something that we can be aware of when we get to know our agroforestry plants really well. That's what helps us design efficient systems. Now, here's an example of something playing or not playing nice. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this term, allelopathy. So some species actually exhibit chemicals that inhibit the growth of plants around them. And it's just a defense strategy, a way to secure resources for their own survival. And a great example of this is black walnut, which produces a compound called juglone. And so you would assume that this is a species that you just wouldn't even consider in an agroforestry system, but that's not actually true. Black walnut is one of the most common agroforestry trees in the Midwest, where black walnut is actually native and grows a little better. But and why is that? That's because agroforestry systems change over time. And I will get into that a little bit more when we talk about examples of alley cropping and other practices. So again, that species interactions, it's ultimately a net result of those positive and negative interactions. There's other types of interactions, pest protection, hydraulic lift, competition, niche partitioning. I won't dig into all of these. That's, again, probably another webinar. But you're trying to maximize the good ones and minimize the negative interactions. That's the general idea. All right, so now I'm going to dig into some of the actual practices, the agroforestry practices. Traditionally, these are the 5 agroforestry practices. There is some flexibility in how agroforestry looks when it's applied on the ground, but more often than not, you're going to fall somewhere close to one of these. A new addition to this is urban food forests and sort of permaculture as sort of the 6th category. And then indigenous agroforestry is also considered its own separate category sometimes too. But these are the sort of traditional 5. And I'll start with windbreaks and hedgerows. These are plantings of single or multiple rows of trees meant largely to modify and redirect wind and protect row crops, as well as protect the soil. And that's really where they became popular, was in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl. Massive soil erosion in the Midwest and the Great Plains. And so windbreaks became a great way to mitigate a lot of that soil erosion. They became very popular. And then, actually still driving through the Great Plains and Midwest, you can see a lot of old windbreaks that haven't been kept up quite so well. Windbreaks and hedgerows are not terribly common in Washington State from what I've seen, but I think that's going to be changing, and I'll mention some really good resources on that soon. Skipped ahead too far, but here's just a couple. I got lots of pictures here, and I'm just going to talk about what we're seeing for a little while. This is obviously in the Midwest somewhere, very flat, not quite like Washington, but a really cool example of a windbreak being designed and put into the wind in order to protect, provides the protective services largely to their home. They're trying to probably cut down on some of their energy bill. But you can actually see, this is very well manicured. I don't know what these species are. It's too difficult to tell. But clearly they're growing some crops here. These are trees that are producing some sort of agricultural product for them. Another example of just kind of at the landscape scale, this is what windbreaks and shelter belts will look like, spaced close enough to provide protection and wind. I think, there are actually tools out there to help you with like the height of the tree and how much wind protection it gets. At a certain height, it might have 70 feet of protection, and so that'll help you space out those windbreaks. But largely, pretty decent gaps between them, and that's how we differentiate from something like alley cropping, which I'll talk about next. This is an example in Washington State outside of Davenport. Sorry if the picture's a little fuzzy, but this is a living snow fence, and it's actually meant to protect the highway there, a stretch of highway where there was a number of different accents because of snowdrift. This is Rocky Mountain juniper growing on a very dry part of eastern Washington where it's hard to get trees established, but these trees are all grown up now. I think they're all 20 feet tall. This is a part of a WSU extension research project, and doing a very good job of capturing snow before it gets into the road. So, agroforestry might not always be just an agricultural practice. I guess it's in this case, it's really helping public safety. And then there's examples of hedgerows, and hedgerows really do fall into the category of agroforestry largely through this, windbreak. So you might hear windbreak, you might hear the term shelter belt, you might hear the term hedgerow. Generally speaking, hedgerows tend to be like a little bit shorter. That's at least been my experience, but that's not necessarily the case. So I think it's just kind of what term you prefer for the most part. But they provide a lot of pollinator habitat. But remember, if you are going shorter, there's going to be a little less wind protection, right? And that might not be your aim with a hedgerow. It might be something more like producing pollinator habitat or producing food for personal use, that kind of thing. And right now, there is potentially some funding at your local conservation districts for hedgerow implementation. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but I believe Pierce County has some funding for that kind of work. I don't know if they do at Thurston. Jay and Kiana can correct me in the chat. And then here's a really, really excellent resource. I don't know if Erica is on the call right now, but Erica Gutman with WSU Extension has developed this toolkit for hedgerows on rural and working lands, and it's really, really awesome. I really encourage you to check this out. I have the link right here. If you're interested in hedgerows or windbreaks, there's just a lot of really good resources for helping you implement that here. Basically, just allowing you to plug and play. I think this stuff is pretty inspiring, and I'm trying to emulate it as much as I can because this is some really great work. All right, so the next practice that we are going to discuss is riparian forest buffers. So these are natural or planted woodlands adjacent to water bodies, and they're designed with environmental protection in mind. Largely from what we call non-point source pollution, which in an agricultural context usually refers to fertilizers and pesticides drifting into water and then flowing downstream and causing all sorts of problems like eutrophication and dead zones. And it's a really big problem in the Midwest for sure, like in the Mississippi Basin, but obviously, protecting waterways is a big issue here in Washington State as well, especially when we talk about things like salmon recovery. So riparian buffers are a practice with major applications in Washington. Now, it is important to note that riparian buffers are mandatory on forest lands. If you own forest land and say you wanted to do a harvest, if you have a stream of a certain size, you are going to have to keep a forested buffer. There's really no choice of the matter. But if you have agricultural lands, and you can often grow right up to the stream, but there are still benefits, a lot of benefits to adopting riparian buffers, and there's some cool work happening around this right now. And a little later, we'll talk about what a working riparian buffer might look like. So often buffers are just natural vegetation, and they usually have a combination of like larger trees and shrubs, especially around here, longer lived conifers. And then there's often this what we call a filter strip that's particularly good at slowing down like soil erosion and things like that. And then the deep roots of the trees do a really good job of capturing nutrients, fertilizers and stuff before they go into a waterway. Riparian buffers, the research shows time and time again, are really excellent at protecting water quality. They do amazing work at filtering out a lot of that stuff that we want to avoid getting into the water. This is again an example of just a natural buffer that they're looking at expanding on here, right next to an adjacent or next to an agricultural field. This is an example of a harvestable buffer, what we would call a working buffer, up in Skagit County at a farm called Raising Cane, if anyone's familiar with that. And they have it's not pictured here, and you can't even see that there's a waterway here. So sorry about that, but there is a natural buffer of sort of native vegetation and native trees. And I don't know how wide that is, 50 feet or so, maybe 100. But then outside of that, they wanted more vegetation. They wanted to continue to kind of protect the water source. But here is where they started growing, non-native trees, which can also provide those protective services, but then also produce products. So in here, they've got elderberries and chestnuts and hazelnuts and aronia and all this great stuff. And then they designed it as a U-pick system. So people in the community can come and pick. And I don't know exactly how he, charges people, if it's just by the pound for anything they take out of there, whatever the birds don't get. But it's actually been a way for this farmer to make a little bit of income on a buffer that's also protecting a waterway that leads directly into, I believe, the Skagit River. So a really cool project and a way to sort of benefit both the farmer and the land. This is another example of a riparian buffer that's being planted up north. And designed in a way that's meant for human interaction. This is I'm forgetting exactly where this is, but the idea here, it is a park, it's a public space, I know that. And the idea here was to plant a number of different species. Obviously, they want some long-lived conifers and stuff that are going to provide shade for the stream. But they're also planting some food-producing species, I think mostly natives, that the community can come and harvest. And it's a way to sort of bridge the gap between riparian, no touch riparian restoration, where we say we want to plant these buffers and leave it alone and let it do its work. But then, the problem with that is that, people are giving up space to interact with. And I think there's a lot of benefits to including humans when we think about riparian restoration and designing them in a way for community engagement. Education and personal use of some of the products created, I think is a really great way to do that. But I'll get off my high horse on that. So alley cropping is the next one. So if you think about, windbreaks windbreaks and alley cropping are both what we would call tree intercropping. Except that alley cropping, the rows are much tighter, but still wide enough to create an alleyway that you can grow agriculture or horticultural crops in between. So this is an example, a relatively common system actually in the Midwest of black walnut and corn. And remember earlier I said that black walnut is allelopathic, right? So it actually inhibits growth of, plants around it. But it's still a really viable agroforestry species because agroforestry changes over time. So with these systems, a lot of times they're growing corn in between when the trees haven't really closed canopy yet. There's a lot of sunlight. When the trees are still young, they haven't really built up a lot of that juglone, that allelopathic chemical yet. And so the corn does just fine. Corn also happens to be a little bit more tolerant to juglone as well. So if you find species that can tolerate that, that works. That's another kind of way around that. But then as the canopy close, what they might do is actually take this out, plant forage, and sort of transition this into a silvopasture where they raise livestock in here. And that's not an uncommon trajectory for something like this. And there was a really cool paper out of the Midwest that, out of corn country, which is really impressive, that showed that these systems are actually more economically viable in the long term than just growing corn year to year. And the reason for that is, if you look at walnut, a tree that provides both a really valuable nut crop, but also a really valuable timber crop in the long term. And you have to think about that. Obviously, yeah, you are losing out on some growing space, and you may even see decreased production due to shade. But long term, between all the different ways that they can be utilized, you actually end up on top. This is another example. This one is cotton being grown in a pecan orchard, I think somewhere in Florida. This is barley being grown in between alleys of poplar. I believe this is in the United Kingdom somewhere. And yes, I was just kind of stealing photos from different presentations I've seen. This is an interesting one up on Whidbey Island. Obviously, it doesn't look like much right now, but you know, it was February, I think, when I took this, and nothing really looks nice in February in Washington. I think we all know that, at least Western Washington. So what this person does, they actually grow native seed from native wildflowers, and they also grow cider apples. And what they've done is really interesting. They graft cider apple varieties onto the native Malus fusca, which is a Pacific crab apple, which can really tolerate wet areas. So this is a really wet area that gets seasonally flooded. And so they're growing cider apples, and those are the tree crop. And then in the alleys, they're going to be growing native wildflowers for seed. And this has been a very productive system for this person. And this was a few years ago. I'm not sure exactly what this looks like now. I haven't been back, but I know that it's successful because I believe they were expanding on the planting. There is some work in alley cropping in hazelnuts in Oregon in the Willamette Valley, where hazelnuts are really popular. So here we have corn being grown between rows of hazelnut while the hazelnut are still young. This is some sort of grain also being grown between rows of hazelnut. And what a great way to make a little bit of extra money, because otherwise, this space is being unused for the first, 4, maybe 5 years of a hazelnut orchard. So a really great way to kind of build function out of the system. All right, so silvopasture, the fourth practice being discussed here, and I may have to pick up the pace a little in order to be done on time, so forgive me for that. Silvopasture combines timber, livestock, and forage production on the same acreage. So this is really important to where that intention comes into play that I talked about earlier, in something that will distinguish whether it's agroforestry or something totally different. In the case of silvopasture, we're distinguishing between something intensively managed versus something like turning your livestock into the woods, which we all know sometimes can go really poorly. And I've seen some really bad examples of livestock interacting with the forest, especially in Western Washington, where it's just wetter and soils are more susceptible to some of that damage. But that's not how silvopasture functions. Silvopasture is, again, very intensive. You're managing all three parts. You got timber or trees, could be orchard trees, livestock, and forage production. If you're not managing all three of those, then it's not silvopasture. And in the case of turning livestock into the woods, my argument would be that you are not really managing forage and maybe not managing timber either, but you're still managing the livestock component. And woodland grazing is kind of similar, where you're probably not managing all three components really intensively. And the real distinguishing factor is a rotational grazing system. You really cannot have silvopasture without instituting rotational grazing. And we won't be able to get into that, and I'm by no means an expert on rotational grazing, but what that does is it frequently moves the animals and avoids some of the damaging effects of having the livestock kind of linger in a space and cause damage to the trees. So it's really important when you're designing a silvopasture system, if that's something you're interested in, look into rotational grazing, and I also encourage you to reach out to some technical expertise to help design that. So I'll throw some pictures here. This is not anywhere in our neck of the woods. This is a black walnut. There's some birch in there, it looks like, as well, and black Angus silvopasture somewhere. I think this is in Wisconsin. This is close to us. This is in Brownsville, Oregon. Ponderosa pine silvopasture with the Highlands. This is a system that was working really well for this farmer. They were rotating them frequently. They have multiple paddocks, and they moved them, I think, every 2 to 3 days. They were at the time I was there. You can see some damage in some trees in here. This would maybe make me think, there's some compaction going on, especially when you look at the soil here. But the thing you can't see is just to the left here is the gate. So you get a lot of animals aggregating over here. Over here to the right, the trees look just fine. And then again, that's because the farmer was moving them frequently and making sure that they weren't damaging the trees. This is Eastern Washington. I'm not exactly sure where. I got this from a graduate student that I worked with that now works at the National Agroforestry Center, who studied silvopasture in Washington State. And silvopasture can look different. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a plantation like this. It could be in more of a matrix where there's clumps of trees. But it's, again, as long as you're managing all three of those components, that's when it qualifies for silvopasture. This is an orchard up in the San Juan Islands. I don't remember what trees the trees are exactly, but definitely managing his sheep through these and been doing that for a while. It's worked really well for this gentleman. This is a retired silvopasture in Matlock, Washington, if anyone knows where that is. This was a really great example of a overstocked Doug fir stands that was somewhere in the 300 to 400 trees per acre, from what I understand, that they thinned out, but they thinned out in this. You can see they have clumps of trees here where there's really not going to be any grazing in there, but the picture doesn't show it very well, but there's big gaps that allow for a little more grazing. So one of the benefits of silvopasture is the shade it provides for livestock, which is becoming increasingly important in our hotter, drier summers. So the goal in a paddock that has trees, where your silvopasture is, it's not necessarily forage production; it's to provide some of those other benefits like shade. Although there are some studies that suggest that forage grown under some shade can actually be a little bit higher quality. It's more of a quality over quantity thing. It can have a little less lignin, be a little more digestible. Um, but it's all a function too of your overstory and how much shade you're letting on the ground. So silvopasture can be quite tricky to design. But one of the benefits, one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of interest in silvopasture right now is that that shade can actually prolong forage growth longer into the drier season around here. And we have these summers that start in June, or gosh, like last year we hardly got any rain in April. It can be kind of more important to have a little bit of shade that extends that grazing season for some livestock managers. All right, the final practice is forest farming. This one's my favorite, probably just because I'm a forester. But I find this one really interesting, and I think there's a lot of potential here. I have the definition there, but what I essentially call this is growing shade tolerant, often very high value products under the canopy of a forest. Common examples include ginseng, maple syrup, shiitake, decorative ferns, but there's really a whole wide array of different things that can be grown, and some that we don't know about yet too, that could be grown in a forest. And the benefits here are retaining forest land, actually really, being able to grow something in a forest without diminishing the ecosystem services provided by that forest. And so there's some crossover here with riparian buffers that I'll talk about that have a lot of potential. So in the Appalachians and the general Midwest, forest farming is a lot more popular, a little more further advanced. Obviously, this is outside of traditional ecological knowledge of managing for non-timber forest products. But in the Appalachian states, they do grow a lot of mayapple and ginseng and golden seal, cohosh, a lot of medicinal shade tolerant products, often very high value. This is an example of ginseng being cultivated in a forest. Now, it's important to distinguish, and you probably already got it here, is that forest farming isn't wild foraging. It's not just going out and collecting oyster mushrooms where you find them. It's actually taking that next step and growing them. And there's some degrees of forest farming, like a difference between wild simulated and wild cultivated, and we won't get into that here. But the point is, you're taking steps towards management. Maybe that's just manipulating the overstory to provide the right amount of shade in order to grow more Oregon grape. Or maybe it's creating a full-on forest garden bed like this so that you can grow ginseng or something like that. But that management part separates it from just going out and trying to look for some mushrooms, which there's nothing wrong with that. I do that too. But it's not necessarily forest farming. Maple syrup is a really exciting one. Big leaf maple syrup, I mean, in Washington State and Oregon. This is something I've been involved with for several years, exploring the idea of, can we have a commercially viable industry around big leaf maple syrup in the Pacific Northwest? I believe the answer is yes. There are some circumstances I think that lead to success. I won't get into the details, but there's also a tremendous amount of potential for hobby and personal use here. So I really enjoy this. I enjoy doing this just for the value of getting out in the woods and tapping, and I encourage people to try that. But in some circumstances, I think this could be also a very, a commercially viable practice for some folks. So the University of Washington did some research on this, and they actually created this model that demonstrate how many liters of sap per tap they could expect. They also did a study that looked at the potential number of taps across Western Washington, just examining forest canopy and where a lot of the big leaf maple is. King County has a tremendous amount of maple. We all know maple is this like kind of weedy species, right? And it's historically maligned in this region. But that vigorous growth actually lends itself really well to making something like big leaf maple syrup. And this is that here. It's a little bit darker. It's a little bit different flavor than what the traditional East Coast sugar maple syrup is like. But it also fetches a really high price. It's like $4 an ounce right now. And there's a few commercial producers in Washington State, and I think there's more coming as well as in Oregon. So kind of early days, but pretty exciting. This is a sugar bush that I manage in Olympia for demonstration. I have about 200 taps, and I do workshops there and stuff and teach people how to tap trees and make maple syrup. Similarly, log-grown shiitakes is another practice that is being examined. Myself and a colleague, Justin O'Day, out of WSU Extension in Clark County, have been studying shiitake, growing shiitake on logs since 2018. He's been leading that project. It's been really awesome, very successful, I would say, in my opinion. This is a practice that's incredibly low input, incredibly low impact on the land. When you think about the amount of space it takes up and what it requires, this is something you can do on a very small amount of space and requires no forest conversion whatsoever, while producing a high value product, a log grown shiitake like that. So it's really interesting. Again, can't get into the details too much. It's a whole nother webinar, but it's really low input. It's very compatible with forest management and riparian restoration. Uses small diameter logs. So thinning out a red alder stand is perfect to create the kind of substrate you need for this. And we all have red alder stands that need thinning. Even if you think you don't, I'm sure you do. There's too much red alder around, I think. So this is in Japan. We actually went in August of last summer and studied how this is done at scale. This is a 10,000 log operation. So I don't think we have the demand or cultural appreciation for shiitake to sustain a 10,000 log operation here. But it is really cool to see an agricultural system that doesn't just disincentivize forest conversion. It actually requires that there's a forest there. The forest provides shade that helps moisture retention in the logs. It's a really important part of that. So I think, Washington State and the Pacific Northwest as a whole is really poised for a lot more forest farming. That's my personal opinion. And I'm hoping to pursue that with some trials and just trying out a number of different species that can be shade grown and provide opportunities for farmers to utilize marginal woodlots and disincentivize forest conversion, but also to explore this intersection between forest farming and riparian buffers that could lead to greater adoption of buffers, because we know buffers work, but we also know that they take away productive land for farmers, and we have to be sensitive to that. And so, exploring these options for, other kinds of agricultural production in riparian spaces to develop working riparian lands will be, I think, really important. And it's something that I am going to be working on in the next couple of years. With this, I won't talk about this too much, but hopefully designing some resources that explore this. Moving along, just to stay on time. Some considerations for adopting an agroforestry system. They tend to have high upfront costs. You're planting trees. Trees are not always cheap. There's a lot of labor and, investing in that system and design. So keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that systems change over time. You talked about the example of alley cropping turning to silvopasture. You have to also consider the maintenance costs. This isn't your annual system. It's a perennial system. It sticks around. And I just would skip to the last one and say seek financial and technical support, because now more than ever, there's financial support and technical support is growing as well. Now, marketing agroforestry products, where traditional agriculture, you're growing one crop and you sell it to one person, and that's at the large scale, at least. But smaller diversified farms know how to do this well. How to market multiple products. And those are really the ones that I think are poised to be early agroforestry adopters. Agroforestry products, just having multiple different products to sell, so it tends to be more compatible with direct to market sales like CSAs and roadside stands, U-Pick we mentioned, farmers markets, et cetera, et cetera. There's also wholesale potential for a lot of crops, but sometimes might, require some market development, and that's something that extension can certainly support. But these are some other tips, I think. Tell a story with your products, be creative, find your niche. Consider value-added products. Terms like natural, forest grown, climate smart can help draw attention as well. All right, so I want to talk about a few planting projects we got coming up. Well, two planting projects. As Kiana mentioned, Sustainable Farms and Fields program. This is a really awesome program that can pay for agroforestry, getting put into the ground. I'm very excited about this. And so Kiana, Jay, Erica Gutman, who I mentioned at the hedgerows, and myself have all been working on these planting projects. Erica had some workshops earlier, or not earlier this year, but last year on planting some hedgerows. I think she's going to have another one. But the whole idea here is to have design some agroforestry projects, but then use it as an educational opportunity, get people out there planting and learning about agroforestry in the process. And it's been very enjoyable. I'm very excited to be seeing this coming through. And so I should have flipped these around to be more in sequence with our timing. So let's talk about our farm that we're doing, not this Saturday, but next Saturday. This is Dancing Goats and Singing Chickens Organic Farm. I'm sure many on the line are familiar with this farm. This gentleman here is Mohammed, who's been a joy to work with. And he has a really great great farm that focuses a lot on perennial systems. And if Mohammed's on, I'm sorry. I had so many pictures I took on our site visit, and I can't find them except this one of your goats eating your elderberries. So I lost all of them somehow, and I didn't know until it's too late. So the project here I'm really excited about, and we're going to be doing two different practices, silvopasture and establishing a shelter belt. So you can see here on the map, this is Yelm Highway right here, and this is the larger farm. Mohammed expressed that he really wanted some, a privacy screen, but maybe one that could also afford some, food producing opportunities. And while we were there, he also, expressed some interest in silvopasture, and it has this area here that is easily quartered off that we can keep animals out for a while trees get established. And this can be a silvopasture space that can provide shade and extended grazing for goats on the farm. Now, there has been some issues with tree establishment on the site, some very dry, rocky soils, and it's had some tree failure before in previous plantings. So this is something that we were dealing with, and obviously influenced our design a little bit. So this is not the farm. This is another picture of just sort of an oak savanna and maybe what we would call a desired condition. And this is the silvopasture design. Pretty straightforward. Wasn't a lot of work on my part, but silvopasture is kind of easy when it comes to that. We're basically going to be planting a equidistant Oregon white oak to sort of simulate what might have existed in an area like Yelm. Of an oak savanna, and that's an ecosystem that is severely underrepresented and was largely converted for agriculture in this region. So maybe a way to kind of bring back an ecosystem. And Mohammed and I are also discussing other opportunities to grow different crops in between the rows in the meantime before the animals are introduced to the region. But we're keeping these on a 25 by 25 center in order to avoid having to thin too soon Oregon oak is a slow growing tree, but it is incredibly drought tolerant. That's one of the other reasons we wanted it. We think it could be very effective on this site, and it's a very climate resilient tree. It can handle a lot of extremes. So we're really hoping that it can kind of pull through on this site. It's slow growing, and so by the time, it gets big enough that we might need to thin this out. It'll be a long time from now. It's essentially the idea. We don't have to worry about thinning anytime soon. And it'll provide shade, but not so much shade that it totally mitigates, forage production. And that's kind of why we chose that early wide spacing. This is the shelter belt, although this may actually change. Without going into the details too much, shelter belts are fun because you can kind of just throw a bunch of species in and see what works. As long as you're mixing tall and short species in order to get an effective, in this case, aesthetic screen effect, but we also did want some wind protection effect. But we're also, again, dealing with this drowty soil that's caused issues for Mohammed in the past. So we chose species that were outside of this fence on this side towards the road. I chose species that were drought tolerant and browse tolerant, just assuming that we would get deer pressure. And so I chose black hawthorn, tall Oregon grape, and shore pine. These are just kind of three different profiles of trees and different height profiles that can kind of fill spaces. They're not necessarily, food productive, especially shore pine. Black hawthorn has some, medicinal benefits. So does Oregon grape, but it's not really the purpose for these. They're drought tolerant and browse tolerant. But on the inside, we have two species that are drought tolerant and food productive: blue elderberry and Viking aronia. Muhammad also has some chestnuts kind of sporadically on the inside there. They're already there. We saw some blue elderberry there doing just fantastic with a little help from irrigation, for sure. But blue elderberry is drought tolerant. And so we know what's doing well on that site. And that is a piece of advice I always give landowners is if something's doing well, don't be afraid to keep planting it, especially if you're having problems with other species. All right, moving forward for the sake of time. This weekend here on Saturday, also in Yelm, we're going to be doing a planting with Cosmic Carrot Farm. Here on the left, we have Warren. Warren's the farmer at Cosmic Carrot. Also been a pleasure to work with. Very excited to be getting these trees in the ground this weekend. So here we're going to be doing an alley cropping system and forest farming. So we're touching on 4 of the 5 different practices with this project, which is really great. And that was just by happenstance. That wasn't planned that way. So the goals here of establishing an alley cropping system that focuses on perennial berry producing crops, and then trying to farm tea plants in patches of forest throughout the farm. Similar soil here, not that far from Dancing Goats. So it's, a lot of that rocky soil that's actually very common in Yelm. But also hoping to minimize irrigation needs. So some of our planting practices, using lots of cardboard and mulch will come through, as well as selecting drought tolerant varieties. So this is a design that Warren came up with. He made it very easy on us. And so we're going with elderberry and aronia and gumi plants. Again, selecting some of the more drought tolerant varieties. I have the varieties listed up here. What you see here is a profile of it kind of looking up top, but not really seeing it stretched out, just like a sliver of it, basically, where you have a perennial row and then a big wide, I can't do the math on this in my head, but a big wide alley in order to grow some annual crops. I forget what the distance is between those. But come out on Saturday and you'll see it in person. And then this is another design that Warren created, and this is the area where we'll be planting. And he's actually got some apple trees back here that lend themselves to an alley crop as well. So this whole area is going to be a really neat demonstration of alley cropping. And then the forest farming, this is pretty simple. We're just kind of throwing some tea out there. We're going to see how it handles the shade, how it handles the drier soil. Tea does tend to like a little more moisture, but we think with the shade that it will be able to survive okay. We chose a couple different varieties, although the mint we don't know what the variety is yet for this one from Minto Tea. We're still figuring that one out. But we're going to be throwing them out and essentially creating a few short hedges. And tea kind of likes to be grown, and it's easy to harvest when it's grown in a hedge on a relatively tight within row spacing and then 6 feet between rows. Although there's obviously some flexibility there. That's just kind of what I had in mind. And this is just a beautiful Oregon oak on the property. So he's got nice little patches of poplar and oak around the property. All right, so I finished with 15 minutes left. Kiana, I don't remember if we actually discussed when I was supposed to stop, but I just assumed it was 7:30. So I hope I'm doing okay.
That's perfect. Yeah, that
Okay.
leaves us about 15 minutes for questions for folks who might have those. And Patrick, you did say in the beginning of the workshop that you would post a link to the Agroforestry project story map, which I think would be really cool.
Yes, yeah, that
So
is no problem.
yeah, so maybe while you're doing that, we will wait for some questions to come in from folks who are listening in. So feel free to raise your hand or put your question in the chat, and we can help answer those. And Patrick, do you mind stopping sharing your screen as well?
Oh, of course, of course.
Thanks.
There we go. And I just put it in that story map in the chat, so it
Perfect.
should be available to folks.
All right, we'll hang tight while people are formulating their questions.
Oh, thank you, Jared's on the line. It's good to he commented that planting is Pilchuck Julia boat landing. Okay. I heard you talk about it yesterday, Jared, and it just went out of my brain.
Eric asked a great question. Are
Okay.
the poplars already on mooring site, or are we going to plant them on Saturday? And they are already on site.
Yes, they're on site and they're quaking aspens, I believe. Yeah. Mostly little patches of clonally reproduced quaking aspen. It's one of my favorite trees. I see a comment here from Bruce asking if it's Camellia sinensis, not herbal tea. And yes, you're correct. It's Camellia sinensis. Okay.
Muted. We also have a comment that says, thank you, Patrick. I'm curious about your maple tapping workshops. They are also a Michigander and a Spartan.
Oh, yeah. Well, go green. Nice. Yeah, so the maple tapping workshops, I don't have any planned right now. Honestly, with how warm it's been, the season is probably over now, and I probably won't do anything again until the fall. But I usually start thinking about doing them in like August, September, October, and then I offer tours sometimes in the off season too. So I just encourage you to send me an email, and then we can, um, you know, hopefully get you on a list for when I do another workshop.
Yeah, Patrick, you have a great newsletter that goes out too. I don't give a link to sign up for that, or folks could reach out to you and you could send them the link.
Yeah, I would probably reach out to me because I don't have a good automatic link for signing up. I will, quickly promote actually. Um, let's see here. Sorry. I am on the board for a nonprofit called Agroforestry Northwest. And in partnership with WSU, we host a bi-monthly work group meeting. That folks may be interested in. We usually have a speaker and then just some time to chat and share. So I'm putting that link in the chat if you're interested in signing up for that. Um, I'm always happy to have more people.
Cool, thanks. Looks like we have a couple questions popping in. Erica has a question. Are you concerned about the aspen clones interrupting the tea production?
Not particularly. I think we can work around it. When the aspen gets tight enough, it doesn't really keep clonally reproducing underneath if there's enough shade. And that'll be up to Warren if he wants to go out and clip all the volunteers as well. But I don't think it'll be too disruptive to the tea.
Erica also asked about the since Quercus gariana or Oregon white oak is a slow growing plant, if we are getting larger stock. And I ordered plants quite a while ago, but I do believe we got larger stock, and we purchased that from Burnt Ridge, and they have a lot of great different size stock of different species. So that is the plan, to establish that earlier.
Erica, I was going to suggest native plant salvage, but I guess you guess
They're
that's not
another great one.
Yeah. Should I go ahead and just read these questions myself? I don't mind doing
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Feel free to, yeah.
So Elise asks, does American ginseng do well in our soils? And that's a really good question. And the answer is, yeah, I think it can. And there is a history of growing ginseng. In fact, Clark County used to have several ginseng farms, but they were doing it under shade nets. They weren't really doing it under forest cover. And then that kind of fell apart, I think, because Canada mostly sucked up the market. I think there's also issues with disease in our Western Washington space. Just how moist it is. So I think it's something that requires more trials, more digging, and trying it out as a forest farm species. But I think there's potential for sure. Let's see. Amy asks, are there different perimeter requirements for allelopathic plants? And are all elderberries allelopathic, red, blue, black? That's a good question. So I would say yes, because some species, juglone is considered to be one of the most allelopathic plants, where you can actually see at the base, there's like nothing growing near it. It's like a mature walnut. Elderberry, that one threw me for a curve. I didn't realize it was. I was just kind of looking up, what other plants are allelopathic? And I think it's considered mildly allelopathic. And I don't know if it's red, blue, or black. I'd guess because black elderberry is there's a lot of agricultural cultivars of those, and it may be something that they've kind of, cultivated out of it. And it probably more of our native species that are allelopathic, but that's just an educated guess, or maybe an uneducated one, depending. My chat keeps resetting, and I cannot figure out where we are now. Are any of you following it?
Yes, let's see.
I'm gonna put it separate.
I am trying to find where we are too.
I want it in a separate window. There.
Is there an issue with thinning Oregon white oak when it's protected when used in the application you planned? Amy asked that.
Is there an issue with thinning? I see. You mean protected from I see. From protected from more of a cultural, not I was like thinking tree protectors. No.
I went too.
Yeah. No, I see what you mean. And Oregon oak is not at the state level. It is not, protected as in the sense that it's illegal to cut it down. It's certain areas like municipalities, it may not be okay to cut down, but in the context of like this, no, I don't. I don't find any issue personally, and I don't. There's no legal issues with thinning it out, because I mean you're ultimately benefiting the species by, redistributing those neat resources to the remaining trees, and that's what thinning does as a practice.
There's a few folks asking about where to purchase plant stock, and so Erica works with Native Plant Salvage, and they are an awesome place to get really well-established stock. A great organization. They, I think, do it two times a year, a plant sale. Is that right, Erica? I think in the spring and the fall. I see.
Yeah, I didn't realize I could unmute. Yeah, I did say that. First of all, Cameron shared the link for Burnt Ridge, which is where you got these oaks, and they're a great nursery for all kinds of food-based and other and also non-food-based native plants. But we do have an online plant sale where that goes up online in kind of mid to late April, and then the plants are picked up the first weekend in May, and the same thing for September, goes up online in mid to late September, and then they're picked up in early October. But people can also always check in with us if you're looking for something specific. We might be able to help you out in between those plant sales, just FYI. And you can connect with us as part of this same grant. We'll be doing our next webinar in March, followed by another field-based project. And Jay shared the link to sign up for our next webinar. And you can also watch the one that Patrick referred to that we did back in November. That's still up online as well.
Yeah, thanks, Erica. And then I'll also mention that the Thurston Conservation District has an annual native plant sale, so that's a great place to get bare root stock, less established, but it's going to come, in bundles and be very affordable. So that's an option too. We often, we have pre-orders open for that in October, and they go through the end of January, so they're closed currently, but we will have a walk-up sale on March 2nd at the Thurston County Fairgrounds. And so if that's something you want to learn more about, you can reach out to me and I can give you additional information as well. And we also have a native plant resource list that we share too that has lots of other local businesses, organizations, companies that sell or offer native plants too. So there's lots of good resources out there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Patrick, you've been looking at questions, so I'll let you jump in and answer some.
I'm back in queue, I think. But I want to see Bruce had a good comment on ginseng and needing good forest litter and deep organic soil, and he's definitely correct. And I would add and say that it needs a high calcium soil as well, and that's why I personally think there's a lot of potential to grow it in some of our maple dominated stands, which add a lot of the foliage from maple has a lot of calcium to the soil, and it often grows in some of those deeper, richer, especially like drainage slopes. So that if I was going to plant ginseng, that's the kind of forest I would be looking for to grow it in, rather than like a conifer plantation or something like that. All right. Bruce also asked any plans to add golden chinkapin with the chestnuts. None current, except high hopes for the the right planting project where that will fit in and make sense with the landowner goals. But yeah, I like golden chinkapin. Oh, and then we covered that one. Okay. Sean asks, unrelated to the content of the presentation, but what practices are preferred for managing holly trees? This is a concern for me before pursuing agroforestry. Well, I can empathize with that. I manage holly here at the field station all the time. And I'll give you a short answer, and then you can always email me for more info. But it's a perennial weed, so it's really the best time to manage holly is in the as the tree's going into dormancy. So basically anytime after August and before March. And if you're open to using a little bit of herbicide, I recommend a cut stump application. It's very effective at killing holly. You basically cut the tree at the base, put a little bit of herbicide. We can talk. I'll tell you which ones when you email me, and that's very effective at killing holly. Let's see. You have a good resource for Oregon white oak. Covered that. How can we send this video recording to some of the friends who maybe missed attending? Oh, Jay, you answered that. Okay. Warren called out Dr. Brunn for ushering ginseng into our region. That's a good call, Warren. In fact, there is a good publication on growing ginseng in our region. But it is also under shade nets. There's no resources I'm aware of on growing it in forests. Any best practices for silvopasturing heritage turkeys, stocking rates, tree species, understory species? That's a good question. I think, and since we're kind of closing in on time, I would encourage you to send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat again. But one of the things with poultry is that they're generally pretty easy on the system, on the silvopasture system, and so that leaves a lot of opportunity. So I'm not saying there's no wrong answers, but it's more flexible than working with like pigs, for instance, which are very difficult. What age do big leaf maples need to reach to tap for syrup production? It's not really age, it's more size. You generally want something to be about 6 to 8 inches in diameter, especially if it's just a single stem. If you have a tree with multiple stems, you can go a little lower, but kind of alternate between tapping each one. And is anyone using serviceberry for more than personal use in our area? That's a good question. I'm not aware of anyone doing that, but it is one of those species that I think has potential for being forest farmed and incorporated into like an alley cropping system. Um, yeah, I think it's a high potential species, but I'm not aware of anyone doing that. And I think that's the last question.
Yeah, awesome.
so.
Right on time, 7:45.
I'm really hitting it tonight.
Yeah, great job. So thank you to everybody who joined us this evening. It was really nice that we could spend this time together learning about agroforestry, and we really hope to see many of you this Saturday at Cosmic Carrot Farm, where we'll be doing a hands-on demonstration of a few different practices, agroforestry practices. We're very excited about that. So thanks again, and we will sign off for the night. I hope everybody has a good evening. See you later.